In the summer of 2024, thick ropes of pale, gelatinous slime spread across the water off Rimini's beach, visible from satellites in orbit, sticking to swimmers' skin and clogging fishing nets along one of the most famous stretches of coastline in Italy. Local officials, including Rimini's own mayor, Jamil Sadegh-Holvad, floated the idea of building artificial swimming pools directly on the beach itself, an admission that the sea the entire town was built around could no longer be fully relied upon in high season. It wasn't the first time this had happened. The same substance, a naturally occurring but genuinely repulsive phenomenon called mucilage, had done the same thing in 1989, in 1997, in 2000 and repeatedly since, and each time it happened, Rimini's mayors and hoteliers went through the same ritual of reassurance, insisting the water was safe even as tourists recoiled from a sea that periodically looked and felt like something out of a science fiction film. And yet, in most recent years, roughly 15 million overnight stays are still logged in Rimini and the surrounding Riviera Romagnola, one of the highest tourist densities anywhere in Italy, on a stretch of beach barely 10 kilometers long. A resort whose own sea keeps turning against it on a recurring cycle nobody has ever fully solved, somehow remains one of the most visited coastlines in Europe. That contradiction is the whole story of this town. Rimini didn't become Italy's mass tourism capital because it solved a problem. It became Italy's mass tourism capital by continually outrunning its problems, one reinvention at a time, switching customers, switching pitches, switching identities entirely whenever the previous version stopped working. War and algae and fading fashions included, and it has never yet run out of road or out of ideas for what to try next. The town's origins have nothing to do with beaches at all. Founded by Rome in 268 BC as the colony of Ariminum, it sat at the meeting point of three major Roman roads, a strategic crossroads controlling access between the Italian peninsulas north and south, the kind of place armies and merchants passed through, rather than the kind of place anyone went to relax. The Arch of Augustus, raised in 27 BC to mark the completion of the Via Flaminia, still stands today, one of the oldest Roman arches in existence, a 2,000-year-old monument that predates the entire concept of a beach holiday by roughly 2 millennia. Julius Caesar himself reportedly addressed his troops in Rimini's main square after crossing the Rubicon nearby, a detail the town still leans on heavily in its own tourist branding today. For most of its long history afterward, Rimini was a modest regional town under various rulers, most notably the Malatesta family during the Renaissance, whose court briefly turned it into a genuine center of art and culture, commissioning work from artists like Piero della Francesca and building the striking, unfinished Tempio Malatestiano as a monument to their own ambitions before their dynasty faded into irrelevance and the town settled back into provincial obscurity for another few centuries. Nothing about that history suggested a beach resort was coming. The coastline itself, flat, marshy, and unremarkable, had simply never been considered worth much of anything by anyone who actually lived there. That changed on July 30th, 1843, when Rimini opened Italy's first public bathing establishment on the Adriatic, an idea championed locally by the Baldini counts as a way to draw European aristocracy into the Grand Tour circuit that already brought wealthy northerners through Italy for art and culture, but had never previously included this particular stretch of coast. The pitch was medical as much as recreational, sea bathing, marketed as therapeutic rather than merely pleasurable, appealed to a genuinely fashionable health consciousness sweeping northern Europe at the time, part of a broader 19th century belief that cold seawater and fresh air could cure a remarkable range of ailments. In 1868, the municipality took direct control of the bathing operation and handed its management to Paolo Mantegazza, a physiologist, anthropologist, and future Italian senator with a well-earned reputation for embracing unconventional ideas well outside mainstream medicine of his day, working alongside a colleague named Claudio Tintori. Their vision for Rimini was deliberately ambitious. Rather than simply renting bathing huts to visiting aristocrats for the season, they set out to build a complete resort combining wellness, health, and organized recreation under one coordinated plan, something genuinely new for the Italian coast. By 1873, that vision had produced the elegant Kursaal, an ornate pavilion that became the social heart of the resort, followed in 1876 by a dedicated hydrotherapy establishment, offering the kind of formal water treatments wealthy Europeans expected from a serious spa town. It was, for its era, a genuine gamble on turning a stretch of ordinary sand into a purpose-built health destination for people who could, quite literally, afford to be anywhere else in Europe. The wager paid off steadily rather than explosively. By the early 20th century, roughly 200 Art Nouveau villas had gone up around Rimini, ornate seasonal homes for wealthy families from Milan, Bologna and Turin. And in 1907, the Grand Hotel opened its doors, quickly becoming the social anchor of the entire coast, its ballroom hosting lavish charity dances and fashion shows that drew Italy's elite down from the industrial north every summer. The town's legitimization as a genuine international destination arrived gradually through exactly this kind of high society patronage. Wealthy northern Italians and European visitors treating Rimini as a fixture of their seasonal calendar, in the same way Nice or Deauville anchored the French social season further west along the same coastline of European leisure. Newspapers of the era covering the Grand Hotel's guest list with the same attention they gave to the opera. Even a serious fire in 1920, which destroyed the Grand Hotel's ornate roof domes during one of its own lavish social events, barely slowed the momentum. The hotel was rebuilt within a few years and kept hosting Italy's fashionable set right through the interwar years, weathering the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s largely as a backdrop rather than a disruption, since Mussolini's regime actively promoted seaside colony for workers' children along this same coast as part of its own propaganda around health and national vigor. The Second World War interrupted all of it, brutally and completely. Sitting directly on the Gothic line, the German defensive position that Allied forces spent months trying to break through in the autumn of 1944, Rimini was bombed so extensively that an estimated 80% of the town was destroyed, its grand hotels and Art Nouveau villas reduced to rubble alongside its churches, its port, and nearly everything else that had taken a century to build, leaving survivors picking through wreckage that had, only a few years earlier, hosted charity balls for the Milanese elite. What happened after the war is where Rimini's story becomes genuinely unusual, because the town didn't simply rebuild what it had lost. It built something entirely different on top of the ruins, aimed at an entirely different customer than the one Mantegazza and the Baldini counts had originally courted. Rather than restoring an aristocratic health resort for the wealthy few, post-war entrepreneurs built small, affordable, family-run guest houses by the hundreds, betting on volume rather than exclusivity, on the ordinary Italian family and the visiting foreign tourist rather than the northern European elite that had defined the town before the war. It was a genuine reinvention of the business model, not merely a rebuilding of the same one. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s and 1970s, that bet paid off on a scale nobody could have predicted even at the height of the Belle Epoque. German tourists arrived by the hundreds of thousands, so many of them that Rimini earned a semi-affectionate, semi-mocking nickname across Germany, the Teutonic Grill, for the sheer density of sunburned northern Europeans packed onto its beaches every summer, radios playing, umbrellas in perfect rows. Rimini's own most famous son, the filmmaker Federico Fellini, born and raised in the town before leaving for Rome, captured this transformed Rimini on film, most memorably in his 1973 feature Amarcord, a bittersweet semi-fictionalized memoir of his own provincial childhood there that won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and carried the image of a nostalgic, sun-drenched, slightly absurd Rimini to audiences worldwide who would very likely never actually visit in person. By the height of this boom, the town could count roughly 1,500 hotels along 10 kilometers of beach, subdivided into some 250 numbered private beach clubs called bagni, each with its own loyal returning clientele who booked the same striped umbrella year after year, an organizational density unmatched almost anywhere else on the Mediterranean coast. That boom lasted about 2 decades before several forces compounded against it almost simultaneously, arriving close enough together that recovery from any single one might have been possible. But recovery from all three at once proved far harder. German tourists, the backbone of Rimini's post-war economy, began discovering cheaper alternatives through the 1980s, first Spain's Mallorca and the Costa Brava, later Croatia's Adriatic coast just across the water, destinations offering similar sun and sea at a fraction of the price and without decades of accumulated overcrowding. Years of intensive, largely unmanaged coastal development had already left many visitors quietly dissatisfied with an increasingly crowded and commercialized shoreline, even before anything else went wrong. The wide-open beaches of the post-war boom gradually replaced by wall-to-wall umbrellas and concrete. And then, in 1989, the mucilage crisis struck with genuine force. Thick algal blooms fed by agricultural and industrial nutrient runoff flowing down the Po River into the Adriatic, spreading across the water in scenes so visually alarming that the New York Times covered it as a mysterious hidden sickness threatening both Italian and Yugoslav tourism at once, an international story that ran for weeks. International headlines did lasting damage to the coast's reputation, arguably more damage than the actual, non-toxic slime itself ever caused physically, since the substance was unpleasant but genuinely harmless, a distinction that got lost almost entirely in the coverage. Together, the fading German market, the coastal fatigue, and the algae crisis very nearly ended Rimini's run as Italy's leading beach destination in a single overlapping decade, a convergence none of the town's original founders could ever have anticipated when they were selling sea air as a cure for the ailments of the wealthy. Rimini's answer, once again, was to become something else rather than simply endure the slow bleed of departing tourists. Rather than trying to outcompete Spain and Croatia on sun and sand alone, a fight the town could no longer reliably win on price. Local business owners and tourism officials pivoted hard into nightlife, investing heavily in the discos, clubs, and entertainment venues that had already begun clustering along the coast through the 1970s until Rimini earned a new reputation entirely. The trendy disco capital of Italy, a title that traded the town's old identity as a wholesome family beach resort for something younger, louder, and considerably less dependent on the sea actually being pleasant to swim in during daylight hours. Entire clubs built to hold thousands of dancers opened along the coast road, drawing a nightlife-focused crowd from across Italy and beyond, who came as much for the evening as for the beach itself, a genuinely different tourism economy layered directly on top of the older one, rather than replacing it outright. It worked well enough to keep the numbers climbing even through the worst years of the algae headlines, proof that a resort built on constant reinvention could absorb even a crisis involving its own literal water. Walk along that same 10 kilometers of beach today, and both versions of Rimini are still visible at once, layered on top of each other like sediment. The Arch of Augustus still stands where the Romans left it, 2,000 years of continuity indifferent to any of this, tourists photographing it on their way to rented sun lounges a few hundred meters away. The Grand Hotel, rebuilt after the war, still anchors the seafront the way it did, in Fellini's own memory of his childhood there. Its facade instantly recognizable to anyone who has seen Amarcord. The 1,500 hotels and 250 bagni are still there, still numbered exactly the way they were during the boom years, still drawing a crowd that has shifted over the decades from wealthy Belle Epoque aristocrats to sunburned German families to today's mix of Italian domestic tourists, Eastern European visitors, and Russians drawn by the same combination of beach, nightlife, and value that has defined the town for most of a century, each generation of visitors largely unaware of the ones that came before them. And most summers, somewhere out beyond the Ombrelloni, the same pale slime that first alarmed the world in 1989 rises to the surface again. A recurring, genuinely unresolved reminder that the resort Paolo Mantegazza and the Boldini Counts built on a stretch of ordinary sand still depends, in the end, entirely on a sea it has never fully controlled, and very likely never will. Every other Italian resort town watching Rimini's cycle of crisis and reinvention over the last century and a half has learned roughly the same lesson, whether they wanted to or not. The sea brings the money, and the sea, eventually, always finds a way to remind everyone exactly who is actually in charge of the arrangement.